I am Dr. Kelly Whaley Martin, and I am accompanied by my co-water lead of the CIM-ESRS, Larissa Smith. For the presentation, I'll start with a brief introduction and then we'll get right into it. We will also be monitoring the chat, monitoring the questions, so please feel free to add in your questions as we go. So Dr. Monique Simair is a PhD microbiologist with a postdoctoral specialization in biogeochemistry, and she is one of North America's leading experts in mine water treatment, with a particular focus on selenium, which we're quite excited to discuss today. She is the recipient of Canada's Eco Impact Award for recognition of her contributions to environmental innovation in mining. Over the past 18 years, Dr. Simair has worked with selenium across academia, government, and consulting, serving as a technical advisor to governments, First Nations, and mine owners. She has extensive experience troubleshooting and optimizing selenium water treatment systems and has led the development of new mine water treatment technologies, developed genetic microbiology tests for selenium bioreactors, and authored numerous peer-reviewed scientific publications in the field. And with that, I will pass it on to Monique and get this going. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks everyone for being here today. I'm Dr. Monique Simair, and as you can tell from that bio, I am a huge nerd about selenium and water treatment. My goal for today's talk is to keep it quite high level and as non-technical as possible. I can dig into the technical details if anybody wants, but I know there's a lot of people that are joining us with a wide range of different backgrounds and different interests and different perspectives. Here's some of the things that we'll go through today. A little bit about me. I was already introduced, so I'm not going to read this out to you, but I am a scientist. I've been working on selenium for a very long time, and it is my favorite element, actually. I'm actually just really excited that there's so many people that are interested in this now and wanting to have conversations about it and wanting to learn about it. Through the talk here, you're going to notice little QR codes on some of the presentation slides, and those link to resources that you could use your phone and go to that site if you want. Most of them are to articles that I've written about selenium and a couple of other websites that have information. And then at the very end, I also have the main QR codes for that again. Please do write down any questions you have. I'll get to as many as I can at the end today. A personal undertaking that I'm doing is launching a YouTube where I'm going to be answering people's questions about mining and the environment, and of course selenium also. So any questions I can't get to today or that maybe need a broader audience, I will be also recording and posting on there, and I'll have a link for you at the end today. So what is selenium? I promise this is the only periodic table I'm going to show today. So selenium is here. This is actually a color-coded periodic table that I created about the treatability of different elements that are in mining and how they can be treated. So selenium is frequently biologically treatable. That's what I'm usually interested in. I want to point out it's actually really closely related to sulfur, which actually matters for how it behaves in the environment, and also kind of close to nitrogen. So it behaves very similar to those ones. You don't have to understand everything that's going on in this figure. Again, this is something that I adapted from a technical document and that I use frequently. I just want to point out that selenium is present in a lot of different forms. And the form that the selenium is in is going to matter for what it does in the environment. I use a lot of analogies, and I also cook a lot. So selenium to me is a little bit like potatoes, okay? You say I ate potatoes, and it's like, well, what does that mean? Did you have French fries? Did you have a baked potato? Did you have mashed potatoes? What type of potatoes? They're all potatoes, but the form of the potatoes is going to impact how much you eat, how fast you eat it, and also what that uptake does to you. So personally, I'm going to eat French fries a lot faster than I eat a baked potato. Or I'm going to eat potato chips a lot faster than I might eat mashed potatoes. And those things also have a different impact on my body if I eat a whole bunch of potato chips versus a baked potato. And so with selenium, it's not just about calories and stuff like with potatoes, but it's about what it actually does once it gets into the body. So selenium is quite similar to nitrogen and sulfur in some ways, and it can swap out with sulfur into proteins in your amino acids. And humans need this. Actually, all animals need this. So there's a couple of specific amino acids, cysteine and methionine, where it can swap out a sulfur for a selenium, and then you have a very specialized amino acid that does special things for your body. The thing is, you only need a certain amount of those. You don't need all of your sulfur switching out. That's where it becomes interesting. I know these two are very small at the bottom, but that's the nitrogen cycles and the sulfur cycles. So you can see they're also complex like selenium. It's not that selenium is this like complete weirdo. It's just more like sulfur and nitrogen than like other metals and metalloids that you see in mining like zinc and copper. So it's a bit unique that way. Where does selenium come from? It comes from geologic formations, and I am not a geologist. I am a microbiologist and biogeochemist. I should actually point out, I should have said on my information slide there, I started in a medical microbiology background, pathology, laboratory medicine, genetics, infectious diseases, and I didn't get into mining until later on during one of my third postdoc. And I kind of stumbled across mining. So it's not something I set out to get into. It's just something that had some really interesting questions and a real innovative group of people working on them, trying to make things better and solve problems. And that really got me interested. And so I moved over into biogeochemistry at that point in my life, about 19 years ago. So I'm not a geologist, but I can tell you that selenium does come from geologic formations. A lot of it comes from ancient oceans and these sedimentary layers that formed, and the living things at the time, you know, especially plants and algae all layered in there, and they had selenium in their bodies and in their cells. And that's where that selenium came from the biological parts of that sedimentation. Selenium in our waterways today comes from a lot of different sources. Yes, mining, but also a lot from agriculture and also energy production. So I'm going to talk about those a little bit today for some contrasts on what's similar or different to what we're looking at in mining. And then once selenium is liberated from the ground, it can cycle through these. This is not my personal figure. It's a great one that I found online and unfortunately lost the reference for, but very good image. You could reverse search. Now at a mine, you dig up those rocks and the selenium is in the rocks. And then what happens is it gets exposed to oxygen from the air and water. And those two things can get the selenium to leach out of the rock because it hasn't been exposed to those things in a very long time. And that changes the form of the selenium. It oxidizes it. This similar but different to how iron can rust. That iron is oxidizing. When selenium oxidizes, it becomes more soluble and get into water. So that's what happens when the rocks come up from underground. It's not something that the mines put into the water. So on a few slides, I've tried to put this misinformation. These are things that I've heard in public hearings, in public engagement, and also I do some teaching in communities sometimes and at schools. These are the misinformation that I'll hear or sometimes that I see online. Selenium is, the misinformation is that it's unnatural or that mines put it into the water. It's in the rocks. It comes out from bringing the rocks up to the surface. Now, there are some types of mines that have more selenium or less selenium, depending on where that rock comes from. So if a type of rock is more related to a biological origin, which sounds really kind of weird to talk about a mine and rocks having biological origins, but things like coal come from a biological origin. Same thing, selenium tends to pair with uranium quite a bit because those two elements separate on what we call a redox front, an oxidation reduction front. And that is like, if you ever heard of antioxidants for your body, like wine's a great antioxidant, that's the same sort of process. Oxidation, it just happens in rocks and in water the same way as in your body, just a different application of it. One of the interesting things about selenium is that it can be released under neutral pH conditions. A lot of the metals that you see getting treated in mine impacted water are often only when there's an acidic pH. And selenium is a bit different that way, that it can leach out under a neutral pH also. So there's different places that we see it in the water at mines and under different conditions. One of the main places at a mine that you'll see selenium being released is from the rock stockpiles. So when you mine, you either have an ore body or like a coal seam, so a highly concentrated area of the resource that the mine is wanting to extract. And then there's a lot of other rock that's associated with it that doesn't have enough of that targeted material to be processing or selling. So in those cases, that rock gets piled up and put into a special place and it rains on that rock. And that's where the selenium can come from. It can leach out of that. And this isn't just the case for selenium. This is the case for most types of constituents that leach out of mine rock and that we treat for in the mining sector. A lot of it actually comes from those rock piles. So it's not even from real processing. It's not from metallurgy. It's actually just from those rocks coming up from underground, being put on the top of the earth and being exposed to oxygen and water. And this also happens naturally, I should say. I've worked in a lot of places where they might build a mine sometime in the future. And in those mountains and stuff where you can see, it's called an outcropping, you can see kind of like the color changes on the side of a mountain when you're driving by it. You'll sometimes see reddishness on that or orange. And that is often natural oxidation where the mountains have, I'll say, grown up. Again, I'm not a geologist. They've grown up and exposed those deposits, and those are naturally oxidizing. It's just in a mine, this is happening due to human activity that we brought those rocks to the earth, or to the surface of the earth. So I just want to point out that it's not from any reagent or anything that's been added to it. You can get a little bit of extra selenium coming out in some metallurgical processes, like gold extraction. I see a little bit of extra selenium sometimes in some tailings ponds. It's a very different process and type of selenium that we see in those cases, but most of it we find is just naturally from leaching out from the mine rock stockpiles. So where else do we get selenium from in our society, our communities? Where else do we see selenium? It's not only mining. So this is something that I hear quite a bit, is like selenium's a mining problem. That's not true. Mining is actually a leader in selenium management and treatment. There are a lot of other places that we do see selenium in water and in discharges. They just aren't regulated the same way as mining. Mining is the most heavily regulated for selenium. For example, in agriculture, it is known, and actually one of the first places that the environmental issues of selenium became recognized was associated with dairy barns. They have very high selenium coming off of them because we feed selenium in the cattle feed in the dairy barns to maintain the cattle health. Dairy cattle need more selenium than beef cattle because of the milk production and the demands on their bodies. So I put some numbers in here. The UG means micrograms. That's 1,000 times less than a milligram, or 1 million times less than a gram per liter. So we're talking super, super small amounts. But again, because we only need small amounts, these things do matter. So irrigation of selenium-rich soils is a huge issue, especially in California. That is releasing lots of selenium from those soils. Similar to how when a mine brings the rock up to the surface and all of a sudden it's exposed to oxygen and water, irrigation is doing that to selenium-rich soils too, especially when you're tilling the soil and then you're adding water, it will leach out selenium. Apply manure to fields, you can get lots of selenium running off of those fields and into the ponds and places where aquatic life are. Municipal wastewater, there can be up to 200 micrograms a liter of selenium in municipal wastewater, depending on what industries are putting their water into that. Now, when you have fully treated sewage, like with the tertiary treatments and everything, that can do a really good job of treating selenium. That's actually kind of like the bioreactors that we use in mining. But not all municipalities treat their sewage to that level, and not all sources of water in a city get treated. Not many people know this, that storm drains go right out to your water source, to your river, to your lake, wherever you discharge to. So there's a lot of selenium that washes off, and it's especially concentrated after a rainfall. So that's something to consider. And then also other industrial wastewaters. Many of those are monitored and regulated depending on where they discharge to. If they have their own independent discharge to a lake or river or water body, then they're typically monitored. But if they discharge into the municipal sewage system, that doesn't get monitored in the same way. Oil refining is monitored and regulated, but differently than mining. And same thing with coal power and electricity generation. That produces selenium if it's from the coal, and it is monitored and regulated, but again, differently than mining. Best practices. So how do we deal with this in mining? We know that some types of mines produce selenium. Actually, the first mines that I was working with on selenium treatment were uranium mines in northern Saskatchewan. It's a hot topic in coal these days. There's some international waters that are of particular interest, but I've seen selenium present in copper mines, coal mines, zinc mines, gold mines, uranium. So it can be in a lot of different places. I should have mentioned earlier when I was mentioning where it comes from, it can also be involved in some associated with some volcanic deposits. So it's not only sedimentary, there are some other places it will localize. So in best practices, I actually teach a course on best practices in mine water management and mine water treatment. I've just got one slide here because I really want to make more time for the questions and discussion. But the best practices in mine water management and treatment always come down to preventing rather than treating. There's a lot of work and effort that goes into diverting water around mine sites to keep clean water clean, to minimize the sizes of impacted areas, trying to get, I talked about the mine rock stockpiles, to minimize the size of those and make them as small as possible so there's less footprint for rainfall to fall on. That always has to be balanced though with how tall are you making that pile? Does that look appropriate to the environment? And when you're going to close that mine someday, what does that mean for the local habitat and wildlife and use of that area? So there's lots of different considerations that come into play. Minimizing those volumes of those materials, so not just the size of that waste rock pile, but the mining practice and how much, what's your ratio of ore or resource compared to additional rock that is mined and brought to the surface. Installing different water capture systems. Once it's contacted, how are you capturing that water and making sure you're recovering it, whether it's on the surface or in the groundwater? And then also a lot of advances are going on in the act of preventing that oxidation from happening. So the way that we build these rock piles now, it's super neat how this is advanced. If you think of, I mentioned earlier car rusting from oxidation. Well, there's things you can put on your car to prevent that rust from forming. Or when you see it starting, there's things you can do to correct it and slow it down. And so similarly with these rock stockpiles, there's ways that they're building them now that stops the oxygen and the water from getting in so much. So we get less oxidation and less release of selenium and other metals. And so that's a constantly evolving practice. And it's a tough one because it's something that has an impact 5 years, 10 years, 20 years out from now by preventing that increase over time. But it's a really great undertaking that's happened and come out of Canadian technologies. Canada's such a leader in selenium treatment and mine water treatment. It's something I'm very proud of to see happening here in our country. So what you look at is your regulation compared to the guidelines, and you have to treat for anything that is above those guidelines. Treatment is typically done in what we call a treatment train, meaning multiple steps of treatment. I've never seen a mine site where you can just use one silver bullet type of water treatment. There's always multiple steps to it. Your drinking water has multiple steps to it, and our sewage has multiple steps to how we treat that. So this is normal in water treatment. We have what's called a trigger action response plan. They have different names in some places, like this is a TARP. Some people like to say an adaptive management strategy, adaptive management plan. Essentially what it means is there's a pre-made decision tree of if this happens, then we do this. If this next step happens, then we do this. And there's more actions based on the different thresholds you pass. We also have what's called a best achievable technology selection process. That is formalized in some provinces like British Columbia. It is used informally in other places, but it's essentially a way that we go about communicating and showing our work on how we selected a water treatment system. I think of like, when you're in school and you had to do a math test and you got marks if you got the right answer, but you got full marks if you showed your work. And so that's what the BAT process is like. Many of the scientists and engineers that work in water treatment, we know what the right answer is, but the regulators and society will only give us full marks for our work if we show the steps and show our work on how we got there. And in fact, in some places, you can't even get a mine permit unless you produce one of these. Then there's technology readiness levels and technology maturation. Because selenium guidelines are always evolving, we also are always improving our water treatment practices and developing new technologies. This is something, again, that's been formalized in British Columbia, but it is used by technology developers everywhere. It's been around since the 70s with NASA, actually. We just use it for water treatment also. Those are also things that I teach full courses on. So just mentioning here that they do exist. If anyone's interested in more about this, I will gladly make little YouTubes for people about this and teach more. Risk versus reality. The reality is that selenium is a concern for aquatic egg-laying vertebrates. I know that just takes a second to think through. Okay, what's something that lives in the water, has a skeleton, and lays eggs? So that's like your fish, turtles, salamanders, those types of things. That's really what the environmental concern is about. I've heard misinformation out there that selenium is going to kill your cows or it's going to harm humans. That's not the case. And Here's just one example. So here's a selenium supplement for humans. Here they say mcg, 100 mcg. That's what they mean, microgram. I used UG in my slides, which is the scientific term. This is 100 micrograms per pill, and it says to take 2 per day. That is the same thing as drinking 20 liters of maximum concentration mine discharge water. So if you're drinking it right out of the pipe of the highest any mine would ever be allowed to discharge, which most still don't, I'll get at that in another slide, you have to drink 20 liters a day of water to get the equivalent of what this supplement is that you would take. And additionally, this is what we call bioavailable selenium. Like when I was talking about the potatoes earlier, some things just, get into you a little bit more easily. In selenium, some are bioavailable, like when I was mentioning the proteins and amino acids, and some are like your body just doesn't know what to do with it. It just can't absorb it, doesn't want to uptake it. So the stuff coming out of a mine discharge pipe is mostly the stuff that your body just doesn't do much with. It just passes right through you. With this type, it's actually being grown into yeast to make it really bioavailable to you and get all that uptake. So this is like really like orders of magnitudes more than you can ever get from a mine. But where it becomes a challenge for the environment is bioaccumulation and biomagnification. And I found this really great image. It's from an analytical services provider, actually. And the QR code there, you can scan that and it'll take you to their website where they have a nice article about what these are and the types of selenium that they monitor for. And so some forms of selenium will bioaccumulate and biomagnify more than others. It's those biologically available ones. I can dig into all the different types. If people want to talk about methylselenic acid, I'm here for it. I just also don't want to bore people to death with that. So we can talk about that too if anybody's interested. I am not a toxicologist, but I have been an adjunct professor in environment and sustainability and also co-supervised PhD students in toxicology departments. So it's not my specialization, but I am fairly well versed in it. And so this has additional concern for sites with legacy contamination, which I'm going to talk about in a couple of slides, because legacy sites have a little bit more selenium around them. We're going to talk about them. One thing that I found particularly interesting about selenium and biomagnification is sometimes I'll hear people say about like, oh, well, what about the birds that eat the fish? And yes, that is also a concern and needs to be watched for. The main place where I've ever heard of that happening is in the San Francisco Bay Area, where it actually came from and is still a major issue from agricultural runoff with irrigation. And there's a lot of studies there. So this is also why when people talk about what about the cows, they're downstream. Unless your cows start eating fish, your cows aren't going to be a part of this biomagnification chain. Also, that's where I had that selenium supplement in the previous slide. In that case, what's happened is the nutritionists have biomagnified the selenium into yeast for the humans to eat so that we can get more of it and uptake it better. So I'm going to jump into regulations here. And a lot of people hate regulations. They think either they're too strict, they're not strict enough, there's too many of them, they slow things down, all this kind of stuff. I think of regulations like having rules to a sport. You couldn't play hockey if you didn't have the rules of hockey. If you showed up at a hockey game and you thought you were playing football, you would really have a hard time. So regulations are the framework that help us understanding what we're doing, how we're going about something, what we need to follow, and that enables us to have meaningful conversations and ask questions. One of the things with regulations is it is regulated differently for mining than other industries. This leads to a misinformation that selenium is a mining problem. It's not. Selenium is present in many things, but mining is regulated more strictly than other sources of selenium. Now, I don't know why this is, but it is. I'm not going to speculate here about the reasons for some of these things, but that's just a fact, is that selenium is an issue in a lot of sectors. It is regulated differently and more strictly in mining. But what that means is that Canada, the Canadian mining sector in particularly, has some of the most strict selenium guidelines in the world. That also means that we are the leaders in understanding, managing, and treating selenium. When you look across Canada, it is federally regulated as well as provincially regulated. And the different provinces and states, when you look in the US, all have different guidelines. Canada's more unanimous than you see in the US. The US is different, and I'll have a QR code in a bit. It's stricter for mines and municipalities. Some jurisdictions require monitoring water, and some require that we monitor fish tissue. So again, that's a different way of monitoring. The thing is, all these different regulations and guidelines in mining, whether it's fish tissue or water, they're all trying to get to that same target of being protective of the environment. All the limits are designed to be conservative, meaning it is overly protective. It's like when you get into your car, you've got your airbags, but you also put on your seatbelt. Now, the mining sector is like, if you did that, but you also wrap yourself up in bubble wrap, and you also drive 20 kilometers an hour under the speed limit at all times. So it's exceptionally conservative in how they've managed that risk. Again, hopping to mine, water, and mammals, because this seems to be getting into the news lately, this misinformation, I realize fear sells, and that's actually unfortunate. We shouldn't be using the privilege of being on those types of shows to get mainstream media to propagate a message of fear. Selenium is not going to hurt the cattle. This is actually me in my 20s. Back when I was younger, I was involved in a family farm of a few hundred head of cattle. So I'm familiar with the beef industry. I have friends that work in the dairy industry. Essentially, a human would have to drink 55 liters of water a day to get your nutritional needs of selenium. So this is once the water's in the environment from the mine, 55 liters a day you need to drink. A cow would need to drink 1,000 to 2,200 liters, which they just cannot do. So just keep these things in mind, because when we're focused on the wrong things, we can't actually have the meaningful discussions about the stuff that does need to be improved. You might have noticed in one slide I talked about a human would have to drink this much water, and in another slide I said a different amount. I did, and that's because I was talking about the difference between a discharge criteria and an environmental criteria. And I actually wrote a post about this a while ago. You can use that QR code to access that article. I try as much as possible to keep things not heavily technical. And also this article has tons of links to government agencies and regulatory bodies where you can find out where these regulations come from. Regulations are developed not just by some random person who says, I think this number should be this number. It is developed by dozens, if not hundreds, of scientists and engineers, both working together and also debating one another about what that guideline should be. Then those guidelines go through peer review. They go through public disclosure and comment periods. People weigh in on it. Different groups and organizations weigh in. This involves academics, governments, and also consultants, all working on figuring out what these criteria should be to be protective of the environment, and then adding on those additional contingencies. Now, some people have a belief that, or an opinion, that the regulations are incorrect. And that's fine. It's totally fair for people to have an opinion like that. But the way science works is if you have that opinion, you back it up with data and information. And then we can discuss that data and information and say, oh, you have a new way of looking at it, or you've brought forward a new body of information that we can now look at and discuss. And this happens all the time in science, and this is how our selenium regulations have developed. If you look back 50 years ago, we didn't know that selenium could biomagnify or become a problem. Information came around, more information developed, our analytical methods got better so we could actually tell that it was there and how much was there, because like I mentioned, this is programmed. So the analytical methods didn't even exist a couple decades ago to be able to do this. The analytical methods for some of the organic selenium only came out in the last 5 to 10 years. And even then, it still is super expensive and super difficult and takes a long time to test these things. You don't have to like the guidelines, but if you want them changed, it requires evidence and information. So consider that, think about that. When people are saying they're wrong, they're trying to say that hundreds of scientists out there who dedicated their lives to studying these things are collectively wrong in their outcome. And that does happen sometimes. We get new information, we learn more, but I think it's really important to think about where these come from and bringing forward evidence rather than emotion and opinion when talking about environmental criteria. There's two places your criteria apply. There's the discharge and the environment. And there's numbers for those that are prescriptive federally, provincially, different states. What happens is the actual permitted discharge criteria ends up being somewhere in between the maximum allowable under regulation and the environmental criteria. And that depends on how big your receiving environment is, how big the river is, how much water flows by, the types of receptors, meaning the types of fish, the types of animals in there, and all these other things are considered to get a site-specific number. But it will never be allowed to exceed the MDMER, which is the Metal Diamond Mining Effluent Regulations, or the newly proposed CIM-ESRS, which is the Coal Mine Effluent Regulations. It will never be allowed to exceed that at the discharge, and it must meet the environmental criteria, which is set by the CCME, the Council of Canadian Ministers of the Environment, in the receiving environment. And the way that we calculate the mixing zone is also prescriptive, and there are documents around that. And I've written an article about that because that's me. I do this kind of stuff, so you can use that link to find that article. Oh, and I should also mention the monitoring is publicly available. You just need to go to the government websites for it. Again, I'm not going to talk through regulatory guidelines here. It's a whole bunch of numbers, but just showing on the right, I have the Canadian ones. On the left, I put the BC ones. So you can see there's some differences there. One has fish, one doesn't. The livestock numbers are different, 30 micrograms instead of 50 micrograms. And the US guidelines are even more highly variable and kind of questionable in some places, or even not present. Some states just don't really even bother looking at it. Others have, there is actually one region of one state that has the most stringent selenium guideline in the world, and that is an area that is bordering Canada. And that's a whole other thing that I'm not going to get into here, but it's very interesting to see how those things emerge. Treatment. There are many types of water treatment that can achieve the guidelines and criteria. There is misinformation out there that people are saying selenium cannot be treated. That's false. That is fake news. There are many types of treatment. There are multiple types of different bioreactors, different brand names, different vendors. There's also reverse osmosis ion exchange with or without electrochemistry. There are combinations of treatment trains, and there's also emerging technologies, a lot of cool things coming out around this. What happens is people often confuse discharge criteria from environmental criteria. There are treatment systems, many, that can treat for discharge criteria. There are no systems that I'm aware of at this moment that will treat to the environmental criteria of 1 microgram, which is not required by any regulatory guideline that a mine treats that value. So when people get confused about these regulations, or I've seen some people who understand the regulation, but choose to use that as a tool to strike fear in people, to be opposed to something, that causes confusion. So keep this in mind. There's a lot of different types of treatment. Again, I teach courses on this, but I'm not going to go into the treatment mechanisms in detail here. I can if anybody wants to. I've actually designed new types of water treatment. I've troubleshot many types that were needing optimization or needed to be dialed in more. So I've worked with a range of selenium treatment systems in my career. Historic sites. This is, of course, a hot topic. It's where a lot of our knowledge about mining and water and the impacts of mining come from. It's where a lot of our regulations have come from. Many people don't know that when a mine is going to open in Canada, you actually have to figure out, how is that mine going to open? What's it going to look like? How is it going to close? What's that going to look like? What does that cost to close? Then you have to get permission from the stakeholders and the government and permits. And then you have to issue a bond to the government, which is held by the government, in case you went bankrupt or something like that. And then they have money on hand to execute that closure of the mine. Now, there's definitely a lot of debate around how much should that be? Is that enough? But that does exist, and many people don't know that. There's a lot of mines that have been operating for a long time, and before we knew about selenium, and there is selenium that has biomagnified and bioaccumulated downstream of those mines. That's a challenge because now, even though the water treatment is ongoing, there is release of selenium from those sediments and from those ecosystems that makes it very difficult to balance out how much selenium is entering that ecosystem. Those are very challenging sites, but it is where a lot of innovation is happening and where we're learning a lot. On the other side, there's legacy or brownfield sites that have closed down, been abandoned. You can go and tour some of these sites, which I find actually really interesting to see. I've been to dozens just through my work, but it's really interesting to see these as a tourist. So historically, selenium wasn't known as a concern. Also, in mining like 50 years ago, there was no closure planning, no water treatment and closure. So there are some problems. But what happens is, if a mine wants to come in and reopen an old mine or redevelop or expand where an old mine was, they have to update that entire site to modern standards. So this is actually a benefit to our environment where that whole mine now has to operate on today's standards, not what existed before. And most of these legacy sites are actually in the care of maintenance of our governments. So either they are not being treated, they're just being left as is, or it's on our taxpayer money to treat it. So this transfers that liability from the taxpayer dollars to the mine to do that work and to clean it up. So that's something to think about when we're looking at different types of projects that are being proposed. Key takeaways. I'm just going to quickly rattle these off in case some people aren't looking at their screens and just listening. Selenium is complicated, but it's manageable. Many sectors have selenium in their water, but mining is the most highly regulated. Canadian mining is the world leader in selenium management and treatment, not just for mining, but overall, we're the leader in selenium management and treatment. We should be very proud of that. Proven treatment technologies exist, many of them. However, the regulations continue to evolve and treatment is constantly improving. Environmental risk is primarily to aquatic egg-laying vertebrates, not to mammals. Legacy mine redevelopment is an opportunity for environmental protection. And we learn from the past and continue to improve into the future. I mentioned I'd give you some places that you'd be able to reach out to me. So here's 4 QR codes that you could scan if you want. There's my personal website. It has more information about my technical background. I have published peer-reviewed journals on selenium. I should mention, actually, I've been an entrepreneur. I've built a couple of businesses, sold them to other engineering firms and such. I now actually work at a university. So that's where I'm at now. I know some people have asked me before, like, am I paid to do this? This is me doing this on my volunteer time. I just really enjoy scientific outreach and helping to get information out to the public. Connect with me on LinkedIn. You can send me a direct message there if you want once we connect. My Substack is where all those articles today link to. And I have my podcast about mining and environment where I will include your questions. I didn't put it up here, but I also have another podcast called The Outlier Mindset where I talk about just some of the tough questions that we face as humans, looking at the environment, innovation, and personal growth. So that's me, and thank you for your interest in selenium.
Wow, great talk, Monique. Thanks so much for hosting that and for giving that presentation. And I know you were worried about it. You were perfectly on time. We have 12 minutes for discussion today. So there are some questions in the chat for you, and I'm just going to read them out as they've come in, and I'm hoping we can generate some good discussion. So Jim in the chat would like to know, how do you chase down or identify a selenium source where it occurs naturally and not directly from mining activities? He's especially curious about forest fires and melting permafrost as selenium sources.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. There is a lot of different sources like that. Forest fires are a huge source of contamination. So frequently they use something called isotopic analysis. And that's a way you can find the sources differently. That's not my specialty. I'm more so into the water treatment. And I'm actually thinking, Dr. Willie Martin, is that something that you're more knowledgeable about, the isotopic analysis?
Yeah, I'm not isotopes, but maybe not selenium, maybe not in the selenium.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I know isotopic analysis is one thing. This is something, actually, I'll keep that written down. And even though it's not my area of expertise, I can think of 2 or 3 people off the top of my head who would know this really well. And I'm going to check in with them and see if I can get an answer for you and post it onto my YouTube later, okay?
What a great answer. Getting a whole YouTube video for your question. And just so people in the audience are aware, this is being recorded and this will be posted on CIM's YouTube. So if you want to go back and reference it later or share it with your friends, you totally can. Our next question is, can you speak on airborne selenium from evaporation and how that can affect crops?
Oh, so airborne selenium is often considered an issue around more like with dust. So if it's like right near a mine or something that might, but I mean, mines do dust mitigations and monitoring. Airborne in terms of, that would be called volatilization, where it actually gets into the air. The form of selenium is typically a selenide when that happens. There has been a lot of studies even on active bioreactors that we know can produce selenides and monitoring for that and how much gets into the air. And it is such an extremely small amount that it is like below negligible on these toxicology types of measures. So in terms of crop, negligible compared to anything else in our environment or your atmospheric air. Also, for humans breathing it, anything like that, the concern for airborne selenium is not a toxicological concern.
I'm going to follow that up with a question of my own. Some sites use phytoremediation to do selenium treatment, and part of that pathway is plants can volatilize selenium as well. Do you have any sources, or would it be the same where the concentrations coming out of the phytoremediation sites would be so small that we wouldn't be concerned about it?
Yeah, and I'm going to, again, preface this by saying I'm not a toxicologist. I've heard these answers from people who are toxicologists in regulatory hearings and permitting hearings, both from people who were representing a stakeholder and for government and First Nations or for mine proponents. So this is a broad statement that I'm saying. We'd have to look at your specific locations on anything. We always say be site specific in mining, but those processes for plant volatilization are so minimal that the air amount is not impactful to animals, wildlife, and so forth. I've had people ask about I design treatment wetlands that can treat things like selenium. And people ask, well, what if a moose eats those cattails? And there's actually a really neat calculation and study that was done in the Northwest Territories. They had a fact sheet before about how much selenium does a moose need. And it used to be on the government's website. And we calculated that for the mine's output of selenium into the wetlands, a moose would have to eat 10 hectares of wetland every day to meet its nutritional requirement. So we have to think about some of these things in terms of scales and magnitudes of what that impact could be.
That's a lot
But yeah,
of
it really comes down, it's those aquatic egg-laying vertebrates. It's the fish, the salamanders, the turtles. That's really where the challenge is and the concern. Sorry, just one more thing about selenium volatilization and selenium in the air. If that was a concern, dairy barns and beef feedlots would be the most problematic, the biggest concern, because there is so much coming in the manure and the urine at those sites, and that is getting stirred up and the cows are walking in it and they're shaking. That would be your biggest concern. And it's already organoselenium, which is bioavailable and available to your mucous membranes. That would be a concern if there was. That would be the place. If you wanted to do a research study, that's where I would look.
That's a fun idea. Can you explain more on the selenium concentrations we saw in the publicly available permit applications and disclosure reports? Aside from total versus dissolved, do those values represent all of the oxidation states?
So I'm not sure which public documents and reports they're talking about. Those will be different depending on what type of mine, what province, and so forth. But total and dissolved encompasses all the selenium. It's all in there, okay? But like I said with potatoes, that's like saying there's 5 potatoes. Well, what form are they in? Are they potato chips, French fries, baked potatoes? So looking at those breakdowns can be important in some areas, but it's not what's regulated. The forms are not regulated largely because those other forms, other than selenate and selenite, which is selenium-6 and selenium-4 oxidation states, other than those, the other forms of selenium are in such incredibly small amounts coming off of a mine. There are challenges and considerations around method error on detection in a complex matrix like the environment, which maybe is something I should write a post about. But so the certainty level on even that measurement of we're not talking micrograms, we're talking nanograms on these things. So no, at this moment, the other forms of selenium are not typically included in any type of a regulatory document. So the total and dissolved are. Sometimes we look at selenate and selenite.
All right, that's some great information. In your experience, what is the best technology to remove selenium from mine tailings, and what about drinking water?
So for mine tailings, typically we refer to tailings as the solid, like the sand that's kind of like beach sand. It's what's left over after removing the desirable metals from it. Tailings water is on top of it. So the tailings themselves, if the selenium's in the tailings, you would leave it there. That's stable. It's a solid. The question is, if it is in the water, then we'd look at different ways of treating it. And typically is similar to any other source of water, whether it's mine rock or other sources of selenium. If it's a gold mine, that typically has selenoscyanate, and you need to look at it a little bit differently. It doesn't treat in exactly the same way as other forms of selenium. It's actually a little easier. It's one of my favorite things. Combine selenium and cyanide, which I get excited about. But yeah, so bioreactors are currently one of the most common. There's many types of bioreactors. There's ion exchange with electrochemistry. They're now sometimes partnering reverse osmosis along with these to make concentrates. All of these have some aspect of clarification and filtration afterwards, nanofiltrations. So there is no one best. It depends what else is in the water. It depends what other compounds you need to treat or might help the treatment. So we would take water like that and put it through that best achievable technology selection process and see what ends up being the right solution for that. Drinking water, very few places treat selenium in their drinking water because you're allowed such a high level of 50 micrograms, 50. But again, if you need it for drinking water, it depends, is that for your house or is that for a whole city? And that decision would be differently. If it's for your house, you might actually do something like an RO system. But for a whole city, that would be prohibitive. So something I didn't mention that I should about treatment is more treatment is not always better. Because whenever you're treating water, you're using energy, like electricity, you're using chemicals to treat the water, and you have waste byproducts. Anything you take out of that water, plus all the chemicals you put in, has to then be taken out and go somewhere. So there's this old childhood rhyme of the old lady who swallowed the fly, and then she swallows a spider to swallow the fly, and then she swallows a bird to swallow the spider. And sometimes water treatment can get like that. It's more isn't better. It has to be an appropriate amount for protection.
Sarah asks, there's a lot of talk about the effect Grassy Mountain will have on the Old Man River headwaters. Is there any truth to this if Grassy Mountain uses proper technology?
I wasn't going to speak about any specific mines in this discussion. I don't know the details about what she's asking particularly. So that's something I'd gladly have a conversation with any group that wants to talk about a specific mine. I often do this type of community engagement where I'll look over a mine project, talk to people about what the concerns are. Every mine project, I will say, has some concerns. Every mine project has things that could be done better. I've almost never seen the issue truly be selenium or water treatment. Those are often proxies that lobbyists use because it instills fear in people to try to stop things, but water treatment is done everywhere on mines. So there's a lot of reasons why we should look at mine plans, we should look at improving them. I can't speak to that one in particular. I'm not sure. I don't know enough about it, but I can tell you in general that's not the major concern for most mine development projects. But yeah, happy to look into that more.
Awesome. So we are unfortunately out of time. There are a couple more questions in the chat. Monique, do you want to just give your contact information one more time where people could reach out to you and ask those questions if they want to follow up?
Sure, I'll put that back up there. Again, thank you very much to everybody who joined today, and thank you for the questions. I really appreciate it. And thanks for being interested in my favorite element.
Awesome. Great talk. And once again, this will be recorded and this will be posted.
Thanks so much for having me.